Well, tissues are made up of groups of similar cells and extracellular material that is secreted by those cells. And groups of tissues combine to form the larger structures of the body and indeed to form the organs of the body. And despite the complexity of all the organs and the structures in the body, there's only really four main types of tissue: epithelium, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. Now, epithelium are tissues that cover the surfaces, and that includes the internal and the external surfaces which are present in the body. Connective tissues give support and structure to organs, and they hold organs and structures together. And fat and blood are also classified as connective tissues. Now, muscle tissues, of course, a muscle is something that contracts, and these are essential for all the movement activities in the body. So, for example, you'll have skeletal muscles attached to the skeletons, the skeletal bones, the long bones, all the different bones in the body to provide movement for them. Then the smooth muscles which line the hollow structures in the body. And of course the cardiac muscle as well, the essential beating myocardium of the heart. And then there's nervous tissue as well. Nervous tissue detects changes in the environment in sensory neurons, processes things in the brain, and then motor neurons go out to move the muscles. But basically it's very simple, just these four main types of tissue. Now, the first sort of tissue we want to think about are the epithelial tissues, the epithelium, the lining tissues. And if an epithelium is lining the internal surfaces of the body, it would be called an endothelium. So you get endothelial surfaces inside blood vessels, for example. So endothelium is any tissue which lines or covers other structures, the internal and external surfaces of the body. And epithelial tissues are composed of fairly tightly packed cells. And we see that there's two main types. Well, we see one type on this slide, but there are two main types. And those two main types are simple and stratified. So an epithelium can be a simple epithelium or a stratified epithelium. Now, a simple epithelium is one in which each of the individual cells comprising the epithelium is in contact with the basement membrane. And the basement membrane is that structure you can see that the cells are arranged on. So this means that there's only one layer of cells in a simple epithelium. They are only one cell layer thick. Now, there's different forms of simple epithelium, and these are described according to the shape of the cells. So the top left here, for example, we see a squamous epithelium. These are flat cells, squamous, as if they've been squashed. And this is good because they can form a very smooth surface. And this is important in the lining of blood vessels, for example, to allow a smooth flow of blood throughout the circulatory system. If the internal linings were uneven, this would lead to turbulent blood flow, making clot formation more likely to occur. That's called thrombosis, and that's a pathological condition. And of course, we don't want that. Now, cuboidal cells are cube-shaped cells, and they're found in structures like nephrons and various endocrine glands. So cuboidal, cube-shaped. Columnar cells are rectangular or column-shaped cells. And these line structures such as the gastrointestinal tract or the respiratory tract. In fact, in the respiratory tract, the columnar epithelium, it is a simple columnar epithelium lining the airways, but it's also got small hair-like structures called cilia projecting from the surface, so it's a ciliated epithelium. And these help to waft mucus from the smaller airways towards the trachea. So if cilia are present, it's referred to as a ciliated epithelium. So we see the main common forms here of the simple epithelium. Remember, it's only one cell layer thick. So a stratified epithelium is one in which some cells are not in contact with the basement membrane. So this means that it consists of several layers or strata. So if you go to a quarry, and you can see that there's been a cross-section, as it were, made through the earth, you can see the geological strata, or maybe a cliff by the seaside, the different layers in the geological record that were laid down at different times. But it's the same idea in a stratified epithelium. There's different layers or strata. And different forms of stratified epithelium, again, can be made up of different layers of cells. So we might have a stratified squamous epithelium, consisting of layers of flat-shaped cells. Or in a cuboidal stratified epithelium, there's going to be layers of cuboidal cells. And in the skin, the cells start off as being fairly cuboidal near the basement layer of the epidermis, but then as they go up, they become more squamous because they become squashed as they get nearer the surface. Having said that, some squamous cells, or the majority of squamous cells, actually start off as being squamous. They are designed to be flat. But in the skin, the cells will be gradually squashed when they die in the upper layers of the epidermis. But of course, the surface of the skin is a very good example of a stratified epithelium with several layers. Now, stratified epithelium is found lining surfaces which are subject to a degree of wear and tear. So, for example, the mouth is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. And this means that during the relatively traumatic process of chewing up your food and bashing things against the inside of your mouth, some of the surface cells can be sloughed away from the epithelium. But that's okay, because it means you're not disturbing the overall integrity of the layer, because there's other viable cells below in lower strata of this stratified epithelium. So it's giving the overall tissue and the lining integrity. And the similar epithelial tissues lining other structures that can be subject to trauma, such as the vagina or the esophagus. Now, some forms of stratified epithelium are keratinized and stratified. Now, if an epithelium is keratinized, these are the ones that occur on dry surfaces, such as the skin, that are subject to particular external wear and tear. Because the keratin is a protective protein, which is resistant to wear, and it's going to be fairly waterproof as well, and it acts as a barrier to the passage of bacteria. So your fingernails, for example, are mostly keratin, and indeed the hair is mostly keratin. So stratified epithelium can be described as keratinized on the skin, or non-keratinized, as was mentioned in the mouth, the esophagus and the vagina as the examples that we used. Now, another form of stratified epithelium is referred to as transitional epithelium. And this is composed of pear-shaped cells, and it's designed to allow the epithelium to stretch. For example, this is found lining structures which need to alter their size, such as the urinary bladder and the urethra. So as the urinary bladder expands as it fills up with urine, you need the epithelium inside to stretch as well as the walls of the bladder. So that means there has to be space for stretching and expansion of the epithelium lining the bladder. And that is what is provided by these pear-shaped transitional type of cells. Now, the next type of tissues we want to consider are the connective tissues. And there are different types of connective tissue. Now, usually the connective tissues contain fewer cells than epithelium, but they contain more extracellular material that's been produced by those cells. So, for example, connective tissues will often contain more strong and elastic components to give the connective tissue firm structural properties. And the example we see here is white fibrous tissue. Now, this is a very strong connective tissue. It's composed of bundles of collagen arranged into fibres, and collagen fibres have very high tensile strength. Collagen is one of the main structural proteins in the body. So the white tissues, the white connective tissues, are mostly collagen fibres, and actually very few of the cells. But the cells that are there in these connective tissues, and especially in this white fibrous tissue, are often fibroblasts. So we know that a tissue is a group of similar cells with associated extracellular material, and that's exactly what we see. We see the extracellular collagen providing the tensile strength, but that collagen has been synthesized and excreted by the fibroblasts in the tissue. So the collagen is a protein formed into bundles to give great tensile strength. Just like ropes or cables, they give the tissue integrity and strength. This is why it's difficult to tear tissues, because of the collagen holding the tissues together. And remember, the fibroblasts are key to this. They're the cells which are producing this collagen protein. But in all tissues, there's actually still spaces left between the cells and the components made by the cells, the fibres made by the cells in this case. And in connective tissues, these small spaces are filled with what is called ground substance. So anywhere there's not a fibre, or anywhere there's not a cell, there's going to be a space. But it's not a space, it's filled with ground substance. And this is also sometimes referred to as the matrix. And ground substance is also produced by these fibroblasts. So in this case, they're producing the white fibres and they're producing the ground substance, or the matrix. And the ground substance consists of water and glycoproteins. And a glycoprotein is a large molecule, and as the name suggests, it's a combination of a carbohydrate and a protein. Now, the ground substance will vary depending on the type of tissue, but it's very important because it's filling up all the gaps in between the cells and in between the tissues. So that's the same for all tissues. There's going to be ground substance rather than empty spaces between cells and between extracellular components. So we could really say that a tissue is a group of similar cells with associated extracellular fibres, often produced by the cells in the tissue, but also containing matrix or ground substance that fills up all the little gaps in between. Now, these white fibrous tissues occur where we need a lot of strength. So tissues such as ligaments and tendons are going to be very rich in this white fibrous tissue. So you might remember a ligament is a tissue which is linking bone to bone. Ligaments link bone to bone. Tendons link muscles to bone to facilitate movement. The periosteum, which is the covering around about bones, is also made largely of white fibrous tissue, although that is also associated with many pain receptors, which are a form of nervous tissue. So as ligaments link bones together, it's therefore white fibrous tissue which is largely responsible for holding the whole body together and keeping the bones in the correct position relative to each other, but to do so with great amounts of tensile strength. And that's good, because if this wasn't the case, then dislocations and subluxations would be common. So a dislocation is where the joint is completely, the integrity of the joint is pulled apart. The two bones are no longer in contact with each other as they should be. A subluxation is where there's just been a movement in the joint. But both of these conditions are remarkably painful. So it's a good job that the ligaments that link the bones to the bones are very strong to prevent dislocations and subluxations, which we don't want. Now in this slide we're looking at elastic connective tissue. And this is usually yellowish and it's stretchy. And it's composed mostly of interlinking elastic fibres. So I think you can see the fibres here are interlinked, meaning the tissue will be stretchy in different directions. And within the tissue are found fibroblasts, and these are the cells that produce the elastic fibres. And the fibroblasts are also going to be producing the matrix ground substance, which will fill in all of the little gaps where there's no cells or elastic fibres. So it's a bit like collagen really. The elastic fibres are made up of protein, but in this case the proteins are called elastin proteins. So they're not the strong tensile strength proteins like we saw with the collagen. They are made up of elastic proteins. And this elastin is really important. It's found in structures such as the walls of blood vessels and the alveoli of the lungs, things that depend on elasticity for their very function. And there's also elastic fibres in the skin, of course. That's why if you pinch the skin up and then let go, it will spring back again because it's elastic. And this is particularly important over joints. And when people have injuries over joints, like burns, for example, and this elastic tissue is burnt away, it's often replaced by more rigid scar tissue, fibrous scar tissue, which lacks the elasticity. And for example, in a hand, you can end up with a claw hand because the joints become fixed because of the accumulation of the scar tissue, replacing the natural physiological anatomical elastic tissue. Now, in the case of blood vessels, the elastic nature of the walls allows for expansion when a pulse of blood is flowing through the vessel. So this is particularly important in arteries. But when there's no pulse of blood flowing through the vessel wall will recoil and become smaller again. And that's important because that maintains the pressure of the blood when the heart is not contracting, what we call the diastolic blood pressure. And this will maintain the blood pressure until the next pulse. And this has the effect of smoothing out the flow of blood, therefore maintaining a more constant blood flow into the arterioles and therefore into the tissues that are supplied. If the arterial walls were not elastic, then the blood supply would be intermittent and pulsatile in the microvessels, in the arterioles and in the capillaries. And we don't want that, we want a constant flow. And in the lungs, it's the elastic nature of the tissues which allow the expansion during inspiration. And it's also the elastic recoil of the alveoli that are largely responsible for the expiration of air during the process of breathing out. So it's this recoiling of the air sacs which increases the pressure of the air they contain to help blow them out. And we know this is really important because we look after patients, for example, with emphysema. And in emphysema, there is a loss of the elasticity of the alveoli. So in emphysema, there's inflammatory processes going on caused by the smoke. These inflammatory processes release proteolytic enzymes that will break down the walls of the alveoli. So in emphysema, we have a permanently enlarged internal surface area because some of the alveolar walls have been broken down. But also the inflammatory processes and the digestive enzymes released by the white cells attracted by these inflammatory processes are going to digest the elastic fibres, reducing the elasticity of the alveoli, meaning these patients find it very difficult to breathe out. And because they can't breathe out, the lungs become hyperinflated. But the trouble is they're hyperinflated with stagnant air which has given up its oxygen, accumulated lots of carbon dioxide, but then the individual with emphysema can't really breathe it out, or because they are lacking these essential physiological elastic fibres. Now in this slide we're looking at loose connective tissue, and this is another common connector. And we can see this is made up of a combination of the past two types that we've looked at. So this contains elastic fibres and it contains collagen fibres. And again, the tissues contain fibroblasts, and it's the fibroblasts that produce the elastic fibres and the collagen fibres. And although we can't see it on this diagram, the ground substance matrix filling up all the gaps with this glycoprotein gel-like substance. Now, loose connective tissues are found in areas of the body where tensile strength and elasticity are needed together, where we want a combination of these two factors. So it's found under the skin, in the dermis of the skin, and between muscle fibres, where strength and elasticity are needed in combination. And some older texts will refer to loose connective tissue as areolar tissue, but it's the same thing. Loose connective tissue is the more modern name, wherever we require strength and elasticity together. So when you pick up a piece of your skin, you can't pull it off because the collagen fibres are holding it on, but then you let go and it springs back down into its normal anatomical position because of the elastic recoil provided by these elastic fibres. So a beautiful combination of strength and elasticity. Now, adipose or fatty tissue is also classified as a connective tissue, and it composes the fatty tissues of the body. So, for example, it's found under the skin, where it acts as a padding to protect underlying structures. And this is one reason it hurts so much when you knock your shin. There's no overlying fatty layer to protect the bone from trauma. So when you bash your shin, the trauma goes straight through the very relatively thin skin, and the trauma is detected by the periosteum, this layer overlying the bone, which is rich in nociceptors, which are the pain receptors. So you can see it's good to have your bones protected by layers of fatty tissue to prevent us from suffering the pain of knocked shins, but all over the body. And subcutaneous fat also gives us insulation against the cold. And women tend to store more fat under the skin than men. And this is why women's limbs often have a more rounded appearance compared to the more muscular appearance often of men's limbs. Women, of course, have all the muscles that men have. They might not be as stimulated by testosterone, but they're all there. But very often you get this more rounded appearance because of the subcutaneous adipose tissue. Men tend to store excess fat in the abdomen, giving rise to a characteristic fat tummy, beer belly type appearance when they become overweight. And that's bad as well, because fat in the abdomen, the so-called visceral fat, is metabolically harmful fat, contributing towards the development of metabolic syndrome and atherosclerosis and other complications. And adipose tissue is also very important for protecting organs. So, for example, the kidneys are embedded in a thick layer of fat, and this fat from animals is taken to make suet, because it's a very fatty layer that surrounds the kidneys. But that's good, because we need to protect the kidneys from trauma. And as fat is a fuel, it also provides energy reserves. So when there's no food, the fat will come out of the fat cells, which are the adipocytes, and supply our energy reserves. So when the levels of insulin in the blood goes down, when someone is hypoinsulinemic, this will allow stored fat from the adipocytes to go into the blood to act as the body's fuel supply. And we can see on this diagram that the adipocytes have a cell membrane and a cytoplasm, like any other cell, but those large areas in the middle are fat-containing vacuoles. So when someone puts weight on, those fat-containing vacuoles will expand, meaning that the fatty tissue gets bigger overall. When someone loses weight, fat will migrate out from the fat-containing vacuole, be used in essential metabolic processes in the body, meaning the individual fat cell or the individual adipocyte becomes smaller, therefore meaning that the tissue becomes smaller overall, therefore meaning the person looks thinner and loses weight. And adipose tissue also contains some collagen-based reticular fibres that you can see running between the cells. Now, reticular means a network, so there's like a network of collagen fibres running through the adipose tissue to give it some structure and some strength, although there's not a lot of these fibres. So adipose tissue does not have a lot of internal intrinsic strength. Now, lymphoid tissue is also classified as a connective tissue. And this is composed of a network of connective tissues termed a reticulum. And as we've seen, a reticulum is a network. And these reticular fibres are composed of very fine, thin fibres which are mostly made up of collagen. But the key thing with the lymphoid tissue is that this connective tissue is just a framework to hold a large number of immunologically active cells, such as lymphocytes, which is where the lymphatic system gets its name, and other useful cells such as monocytes and macrophages. And the main function of the lymphoid tissue is to protect the body against the threat of infection. So you might think of the lymphoid tissue in the lymph nodes, in the spleen, the tonsils, and parts of the appendix are also made of lymphoid tissue. So remember, the lymphoid tissue has got this very important immunological function, and it stops us all from dying of sepsis. Now, cartilage is a connective tissue which performs functions such as joining the ribs to the sternum, forming the costal cartilage, and it also forms intervertebral pads between the individual vertebrae. Now, articular cartilage lines the surface of joints, in synovial joints particularly, giving a smooth, hard, low friction surface between bones, so that the movement of joints is nice and smooth. And like other connective tissues, cartilage is composed mostly of connective fibres made of collagen. And the ground substance is hard but flexible, consisting of water with some different types of collagen in it and some specialised large protein-based molecules. So the same components are there, they are just designed to give the tissue the particular required emergent function that is required of that tissue. And the cells in cartilage which produce the collagen and ground substance are also found within the tissues, within the cartilage tissue, and they're called chondrocytes. So chondrocytes are the main cellular constituent of the cartilage, producing the extracellular components, giving rise to the overall tissue. Now, osseous tissue, of course, makes up the bones, but it's still described as a connective tissue. Now, bone is hard in order to give the body a supportive, protective framework. So it supports and it also protects underlying softer structures, such as the heart, the lungs, and the brain. And the basic structure of bone is similar to other forms of connective tissue. It contains tough, strong collagen fibres and the cells which produce them. And the cells responsible for bone formation are called osteoblasts. So again, we have the osteoblasts and the extracellular material that they secrete. But the reason that bone is so hard and rigid compared to other tissues is that the ground substance is composed of mineral salts, mostly calcium and phosphates. But if you actually dissolve away these in an acid solution, you are left with the collagen fibres, and bones become flexible and bendy once all the ground substance has been dissolved away by the acid. But in the normal anatomical situation, the ground substance is the mineral salts, calcium, and mostly calcium with some phosphates as well. Now, the blood is also classified as a connective tissue, but that's dealt with in other presentations in more detail. Now, the third type of tissue is muscle tissue. So we've talked about epithelial tissue, connective tissues, now muscle tissue. And there are three main types of muscle tissue: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. And we're going to start off by thinking about the skeletal muscle tissue. Now, skeletal muscle is sometimes referred to as striated because of its striped appearance when we look at it in more detail, especially with a microscope. And it's attached to bones via tendons to allow voluntary movement of the skeleton. So it's sometimes called voluntary muscle because it's under the control of our will. Now, skeletal muscles are usually arranged in antagonistic pairs to allow movement in 2 or more directions. Now, antagonistic means they are set in opposition to each other in order to bring about opposite movements. So if you want to extend your arm, the tricep muscle contracts, straightening your arm. However, if you want to flex your arm, that is bring your hand up towards your shoulder, then the bicep muscles will contract. Now, this arrangement is required, it's essential, because muscles can only contract. So no matter what muscle we're talking about, it can only contract. It's active muscular contraction. Muscles can never make themselves get bigger, they can only contract. That's why we need this arrangement of the antagonistic pairs of muscles. Now, skeletal muscles are unusual in that the cells can contain many nuclei. So normally a cell only has one nucleus in a cytoplasm. That's not as clear in skeletal muscles. And the muscle cells form long striated structures called fibers. And here we're looking at a skeletal muscle fiber, a single fiber with alternating dark and light bands. That's why it's called striated, because it's striped. But we notice that there are multiple nuclei in the cell. And these muscle fibers are roughly cylindrical, and they can be 30 centimeters or more in length, so they can be quite long. And in a skeletal muscle, individual muscle fibers run parallel with each other. And using a light microscope, the individual muscle fibers are seen to contain these alternating light and dark bands, giving the fibers the striped or striated appearance. Now, this situation is seen because within the muscle fibers, that is inside the muscle cells, are bands of specialized contractile proteins which are designed to contract. And the striations are composed of the 2 contractile proteins, and these are called actin and myosin. And a muscle contracts, as a muscle contracts, the actin and myosin fibers will pull into each other and will overlap. And this has the effect of reducing the length of the whole muscle fiber. Now, the energy required for the contraction of muscles is produced by the mitochondria, and these are located within the muscle cells, because the mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cells. So muscles will contain a large amount of these mitochondria to produce the energy required. And the muscle fibers are held together by connective tissue. And this continues to form tendons at the end of the muscle. And there is a sheath of fibrous tissue over the surface of the muscle. But this connective tissue holding these muscle fibers together goes on to form the tendons. And it's the tendons that connect the muscle to the bone. Now, in this picture, we're looking at a larger scale, so we can see many individual muscle fibers arranged together, held together by these connective tissues. So these are many of the individual muscle fibers that we saw in isolated presentation in the previous slide. So the muscle fibers are held together by connective tissue, and this continues to form the tendons. And as we've said, this links the muscle to the bone. So that means when all these muscle fibers contract, the muscle will shorten, pulling the tendon, and because the tendon is attached to the bone, that will also pull and therefore move the bone as well. Now, smooth muscle is not striated, and it's found in places like the walls of hollow structures. For example, there's some in the walls of blood vessels and the stomach, and the intestine and the bladder. And it's usually involuntary, that is under the control of the autonomic nervous system, meaning that it's automatically controlled. And indeed in the small intestine, indeed generally in the intestine, there's a network of nerves controlling the muscle called the enteric plexus, an intrinsic sort of nervous system within the gut itself. But it's still autonomic because the muscle is working automatically. And smooth muscle contracts more slowly than striated muscle, but it can contract very powerfully. So, for example, the myometrium composes the middle layer of the uterus, and that's composed mostly of smooth muscle. And this is able to generate a force of contraction sufficient to deliver a baby through the birth canal. Very powerful contractions. And often smooth muscle contractions are sustained, and they're often rhythmic in nature. The individual cells making up the tissues are long and tapered at the ends, and they're held together by connective tissue. And like striated muscle, they contain contractile proteins. But these are not arranged in a way which gives rise to the striated appearance. So the contractile proteins are still there, but they're not arranged in the same way to give the same visual appearance, as would be the case in the striated skeletal muscles. Now, cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. It composes the myocardium, which is the middle muscular layer of the heart, the contractile muscle of the heart, powering contractions of the atria and of the ventricles. And like skeletal muscle, it's also somewhat striated in appearance. Now, because cardiac muscle is not under the direct control of the will, it is a form of involuntary muscle. And as we see in this diagram, individual cardiac muscle cells link up with each other to form networks throughout the tissue. And these interconnections between the individual myocytes allow electrical impulses to travel across the tissue. And this is important because the muscle is stimulated to contract by these electrical impulses. And cardiac muscle is able to rhythmically contract about 70 times a minute for a full lifetime. So these myocytes are contracting from a few weeks after you're conceived up until a few minutes before your brain dies at the time of your death. And I once worked out that this may be in excess of 2.8 billion individual contractions. So pretty amazing muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue. Now this mind map is showing the classification of tissues. So we can see that the main types of tissue are connective, epithelium, muscle, and nervous tissue. Connective tissue can be white fibrous, loose connective, elastic connective, adipose connective, lymphoid, cartilage, bone, and we also include blood in this classification. The epithelial tissues are subdivided into simple or stratified. The simple are only one cell thick, and the cells can appear squamous, cuboidal, columnar, and they can be ciliated as well. Alternatively, the epithelial tissue can be stratified, and stratified epithelium can be keratinized or non-keratinized, and it can also be the transitional form. The third type of muscle tissue we can see on this diagram is muscular, and there's only skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. And the fourth type of tissue is nervous tissue. Now a nerve is a neuron, so there can be motor neurons, relay neurons, sensory neurons, or any of the central nervous system neurons as well. So all the nervous tissue in the body is either in the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system being the brain and spinal cord, the peripheral nervous system being all of the neurological tissue in the body. But this is dealt with extensively in other programs, other presentations on this channel, so feel free to look for those if you want more detail on those. So that's just a quick introduction to tissues. We see it's connective, epithelial, muscle and nervous. We see that tissues are made up of cells and the extracellular components which are produced by those tissues. And we see that tissues are arranged in clever, intricate ways to provide anatomical structures and facilitate physiological functions.